Serbia is at an economic, diplomatic and political tipping point where it must choose to either stick with Russia and sink alongside with Russia or gain the support and stability of the EU. This stability was always going to be way more in the interest of Serbia than any symbolic concessions about Kosovo. We would rather that Serbians have food on their table than be offended that their primary school class teaching was wrong. AF has to do so much more to explain why we should care about Kosovo at the expense of all of the practical, tangible benefits you get from the EU. So a few things in this speech, firstly on setup, secondly on why joining the EU gives you a bunch of benefits, and then finally on why withdrawing is actively really harmful. So, firstly in terms of setup, first point of setup is to explain what is happening right now. That is to say that Serbia has wanted to join the EU for a while, and the EU has identified Serbia as a candidate for a while, meaning that Serbia is currently in a pre-accession stage of joining. That means that already a bunch of deals have been signed, things like the 2013 stabilisation deal, that has given Serbia access to some degree of the EU market and some degree of EU power, but not fully. And the only thing that is remaining is kind of like to sign off this deal at the end. Why has it not been signed off and completed so far? We think there's two main reasons. And the first to say is that Serbia has historically been close to Russia, which is an anti-EU stance. And secondly is because EU wants it, because EU has imposed a condition of creating peace with Kosovo. And I'd like to note here that while the deal was originally that the EU wanted Serbia to accept Kosovo as legitimate, that has now been changed because of these negotiations. And now it has been changed that they just have to have a stable and normalized relationship, which means that they do not even need to recognize that symbolicness. They just need to not be mean to Kosovo all the time. And then the structural reason for this is also that obviously the EU cares way more about practicality instead of sovereignty. They want to have peace in the region because that is better for the EU and the stability of the EU as a whole, and so they would prefer to have a normal relationship than any kind of symbolic point. Second part of setup is to explain what the interests of Serbia are, and we think that the first and most important interest of Serbia is to provide for its people, is to be successful, is to be prosperous and stable. We think that these were the most practically important, and especially given stuff like the fact that they have a history of conflict, they obviously want stability, but also just because they're a democracy, so obviously they have to account for what their people want. People care more about food on the table. And sure, we agree they probably do have some symbolic nationalist interests, like caring about Kosovo, but we think that these are importantly fading over time, because structurally the people impacted by the Yugoslav wars, the group of people impacted by the Yugoslav wars is getting much smaller, and they're being replaced by young people who are more progressive and who weren't impacted by that personally, so they simply do not care as much. So, onto the first bit of substantive then on why joining the EU is going to give you a bunch of benefits, and this is essentially just to provide a list of really practical and tangible reasons why this is in the interest of Serbia. So we have a few different benefits that you get here. First one is just that you get economic stability by getting things like joining a common currency. What it means when you have a common currency is that the EU now has a massive investment in your financial situation. That is to say they're more likely to do things like bail you out, give you loans, etc. Because obviously if your market tanks and your currency gets inflated, that impacts the entirety of Europe, which means you get way more economic stability. Secondly, you get more developmental aid. That is because the EU has given already a large budget for Serbia to do things like build infrastructure, invest in education, but obviously this has been planned but not yet implemented because you're not part of the EU yet. If you withdraw, then you lose all of that potential funding that you were going to get. But thirdly, I would just give a set of logistical benefits. That is to say, firstly, you get visa exemptions for your workers. It's easier to send them overseas, get them to work, stuff like that. Secondly, you get preferential access to EU markets. This means you can do things like trade with no tariffs. That's just better for your economy. And you also get things like first access to products. This is uniquely important for Serbia because Serbia is a small country that does not have a well-rounded economy. They only really focus on grain, so they necessarily need a diverse trade portfolio in order to access all the resources you need to be a country. So having less tariffs is a massive, massive benefit for Serbia because it necessarily needs to import stuff. And note here that we are looking for long-term economic benefits here. It is worth making compromises in the short term because of how much stability this is going to give you in the long term. But the third and most important part of this point is to explain that Serbia can get the benefits of entering the EU without the harms of concession because it is in the pre-accession phase right now. That is to say, after the 2013 stable agreement, Serbia has already got all of these benefits to some extent, but not to the full extent. That is things like slightly preferential access to EU markets already. That is things like visa restrictions are still there, but far more relaxed than they were before. That is things like you get a seat in economic forums, meaning you're able to do things like influence regional political affairs, things like that. And so we think that, and why is the EU willing to do this to Serbia? It is willing to do this because it expects that eventual membership of Serbia, so it is giving it this stuff in the meantime during the process. What does this therefore mean when you withdraw? This means that as well as being unable to unlock all the benefits I just explained, you lose all that you've got currently. As well as not getting additional economic benefits, you get tangible economic harms because now you lose all those benefits, you lose all of those easier things, so it makes it way harder for you, and you have to be able to recover to that and regain your stability. And note how burdened here, we don't even need to prove to you that you need to join to get all our benefits, because we can just prove that withdrawal is so actively harmful, because you're going to lose a bunch of stuff that you already have. This makes it really hard for Serbia to be able to adapt to that. The way here is that if joining the EU gives you these economic benefits and stability, that is obviously the biggest and easiest path to victory, because that is obviously in the interest of Serbia to be stable and to be prosperous. And so And this is like an excellent deal from the EU, there's no reason not to accept it. But, second part of this speech is to explain why withdrawing is actively going to be harmful. 3 parts to this. Firstly, why you get harms from China, secondly on Russia, and finally on Kosovo. So, firstly, just talk about China and why your relations with China get first when you withdraw. That is to say that at the moment, China has a vested interest in the Balkan corridor as part of its Belt and Road plan and wants to get control over that access of the world in order to be able to trade. And this is fairly crucial to its economic plans. That means it wants to do things like build infrastructure, etc. But note firstly that China has a lot of discretion in how it engages in that region. That is to say, it can do things like give you quite good deals that give you still independence while also having infrastructure to help China, or it can do things like give you bad deals where you get stuck in a debt trap. And the thing that determines which option you get is the amount of bargaining power you have as a country. That is to say, it is very easy for China to manipulate small countries into letting China build whatever it wants, whereas obviously if you're more powerful diplomatically, you have more power to negotiate those deals with China. Therefore, if you withdraw your EU membership, you lose all bargaining power that you currently have. That is because you now have no diplomatic support from the EU to help you out with this. You have no economic bargaining power because you only have one industry and you don't have many trade connections, which means that China can literally just walk all over you and make you accept any deal it wants to give you because you're probably quite desperate, and you literally can't even turn to the EU anymore because they're probably mad at you for withdrawing anyway. You lost all the stuff that you had in the pre-accession phase, whereas on our side, when you stay in that pre-accession phase, you can play both sides, you can get the support of the EU, you can maintain your sovereignty and get a way better deal from China. That was far better for Serbia. Second part of this argument on Russia and why it gets way worse, why your relationships Russia get way worse. And I'll engage with some of the substantive they give you here. The framing here is to say that yes, relationships with Russia have been historically very strong, and it has been a strong ally because of your reluctance to join the EU. But the opposition relies on a very outdated characterization of Russia as an economic and military superpower, which is simply no longer true. They are losing the war, they are in a massive economic struggle, and they are not able to help you. So we think that your relationship with Russia is no longer relevant. Why? For a few reasons. Firstly, Russia can't give you any economic help now. That is because Russia is in a massive debt for the war that it is losing. It has to keep on putting money into it. It has nothing left to give you. But secondly, just that Russia's already got so many sanctions, right? Like, it literally just does not have stuff left. Like, it does not have any economic fluidity to be able to help you. This is one of the stuff that they tell you about how Russia's going to put economic embargoes on you and give you bad trade deals, because they literally cannot afford to sacrifice any trade deals more because you're pretty much the only one that they've got. So no, they're not going to put sanctions on you because they are so desperate, but also that even if they did keep those deals, they could never provide as much of a trade portfolio as the entire EU, where you now get access to the entire market of Europe. That was a way, way better trade advantage than anything that Russia could give. Second thing to say is that Russia has lost all of its diplomatic breadth. That is because its allies are abandoning Russia all throughout Europe. It has no more diplomatic power, it has no more power in the region, and the third thing just to say is that the military weakness of Russia has now been exposed, and then say, oh, Russia might be angry and attack you. Literally, they are already losing a war in Ukraine. Why would they target Serbia of all places? They have no incentive to attack you specifically over all the other allies that have left them, and they have no capacity because their military is exhausted. What is the harm here? You're joining a sinking ship. Without Russia, there is literally no reason for you to not joining the EU. You must join the EU in order to get any stability in trade deals. Finally, on Kosovo, the framing here is that the concession that you need to make here is so small because you literally just need to accept peace and accept stability. And note all the framing I give you and set up as to why people don't care about Kosovo that much anymore. They've moved on. They're a distinct identity population. They've been a nation for 30 years. They're already doing their own thing. It is going to be so hard for you to get them back. This is a futile effort and you should not wait highly. So proud to be today.
I thank that speaker very much for their speech and welcome the second speaker of the affirmative team.
Okay, so first start with some setup, and then two pieces of substantive about how we actually win economics benefits on under our side, and also second of all, their point about security of the EU and how it's going to be so much safer in a world where they actually have something to fight Russia with, which you think is completely not true at all. Okay, first of all, setup. Two pieces of setup that I wanted to do. What does EU membership actually look like for Serbia? And second of all, what does Serbia actually look like as a country geographically and economically? Okay, first of all, what does the EU membership look like for Serbia? Okay, so they were like, oh yeah, Serbia's going to be able to influence like regional affairs, and they're going to be able to like exert massive political and economic like power over like all of EU, because now all of a sudden they're able to have like these currency and this all this sort of stuff, which I'll mitigate later. First of all, I'm going to mitigate this. So, Serbia is extremely economically small and a very, very new member state. We have three main reasons exactly why Serbia is probably not going to have a really large say in the EU. First of all, Serbia is unlikely to have any leverage or political power within the EU. Note that these forums operate on leverage and also political power. How much say you have? This is exactly why you have things like the Security Council and the UN that have much more power than member states, right? This is exactly what's going to happen in the EU. Serbia does not have economic or like any form of manufacturing like power over other states. We think that Serbia is likely to just be like a sitting duck within the EU, like a bit of a bot, to be honest. Second of all, we also think that nations like Croatia and like that don't like Serbia, for example, Albania, are probably not like, first of all, are going to have much more say because they're economically and politically larger. And second of all, because they have a long-standing membership and relation with the EU. We think that this is like completely mitigating their power, like their ability to make any influence within the EU, because Serbia is a new member state, extremely small. These like states that don't like them, that are also their neighbors, are already in the EU, have long-standing political connections, and also economically bigger. We think that their entire point about regional dominance is completely ridiculous when it actually occurs in the EU. Also, third of all, Serbia is extremely orthodox and Christian. And what does this mean? You're probably unlikely to have say or power with a neoliberal institution that is A, very secular, 2, very progressive, and 3, does not align with any of your country's beliefs, right? You're probably not going to have any form of say. And also, as my first speaker already said, you're probably unlikely to align with any of their values. EU is more likely to push things that you don't like onto you, right? And like force things onto you that your institution doesn't believe, because these two institutions, Serbia and the EU, are completely different. Okay, now onto and so why is this important and how does this impact? This piece of rebuttal literally mitigates their like entire political and economic benefit, because we think a lot of the things are negated by the fact that A, they have no political say, and second of all, they're going to be pushed like bad political and economic things that their country doesn't agree on, and also surrender sovereignty. Okay, what does Serbia look like? We gave you some like really good characterizations of Serbia at first speaker. Manufacturing and agricultural like exports are their biggest things, and they export it to Russia mostly. Second of all, religious, conservative, orthodox. So also I'd like to note that EU relations already occur in the status quo. Example with Germany, example like they have like trade deals with other countries in the EU. We think that a lot of this is symmetric on our side. Also, we think that they're economically dependent on their geographically closest superpower, right? The person that like the huge looming guy that just like is right above them. We think that they rely on them because of fertilizer, because of petrol. I'll talk about this later. They also export a lot of manufacturing to Russia, and also we think they're more politically aligned with non-EU states, such as like Slovenia, things like this, like countries around them, rather than the EU. Okay, now to my two main pieces of substantive: economic benefits, how we get it under their side, and how we mitigate it on their side. Sorry, how we get it on our side and how we mitigate it on their side. Second of all, security of the EU. Okay, so the Russia, like they had this entire point, which I think is like. Judges, Russia is not weak, right? Because of you, like they said, like, oh, because of Ukraine, Russia is now this poor little guy that just like sits in the corner and has nothing to do with themselves. First of all, completely untrue. Oil and fertilizer are the biggest exports of Russia. Russia has so much control. Too many examples to show this. I don't even think I need to mechanize this. First of all, when Sri Lanka occurred and Russia was able to remove its fertilizer exports from Sri Lanka, what happened to the Sri Lankan economy? They literally crumbled. And what happened because of that? China came in and started doing infrastructure projects in Sri Lanka. This is what their world looks like. Second of all, and also Uralkali is one of like the biggest monopolies in Russia. It is huge. It exports most of the fertilizer to the entire world. Second of all, look at Europe. What happens after Russia imposed sanctions and cut off the Europe pipeline, right? Huge quality of life decrease, huge rise in prices. Russia definitely has leverage. And also, we think that because, and I'll talk, okay, moving on. Ukraine is like a project and not their economy. There's like this complete disconnect between the fact that Ukraine represents their economy in any way. There's like political reasons why like they're not engaging in Ukraine as much as they could be. Okay, second of all, they had this common currency idea. We think that common currency, they haven't actually mechanized why this is good for why this is actually beneficial for Serbia in specific. We think that rather it's a better idea, it's a better world where for Serbia, like they have better relations with their neighbors, where their neighbors are actually like like for example, Russia, rather than being alienated by their neighbors. And also we think that because Serbia has a poor relationship with the West, as you already said, like within the EU, like Kosovo and all this sort of stuff, we think that like they haven't been able to mechanize why these trade deals will just suddenly appear when they join the EU. We think a lot of these like we think that on our side instead, Russia has a vested interest in Serbia to not join the EU, and therefore it's probably more likely to invest in like things like Serbia rather than the EU, which is like a huge conglomerate of like an organization that has no specific interest in Serbia, but rather Russia has a vested specific interest in Serbia in order for it to not join the EU. We think these incentives are way bigger. Also, they had like this entire point about the economic benefit of the EU. We wanted to note the fact that fertilizer and manufacturing are the biggest exports, and they're super closely tied, like Serbia and Russia, right? And so we weigh the likelihood of their where they have like this free trade and aid, which I've already dismantled because I've shown them that you won't actually get those free trade agreements, and probably like not very good. And note, most members are not fans of Serbia and also in the EU. And then on the outside, where we get concrete benefits, concrete harm, where there are sanctions from Russia, where their biggest exporter and importer, like that they rely on for like products for fertilizer and their agriculture in their country, is completely sanctioned and cutting it off. And then that leads me on to that point about food on the tables. This is exactly where food does not get on the tables because there's no fertilizer to grow crops, just like it happened in Sri Lanka. We think that this is their side and not ours. Then they had this entire point about China that I quickly wanted to do, which I think is completely unrealistic. The Belt and Road Initiative is not a debt trap. This has been debunked so many times. This is not true at all, because like you can't coerce a country into like debt trapping themselves out of sovereignty. We think that this is a huge myth and an empirical truth. And we think that on our side, rather, we get a way more big benefit from China, where the Belt and Road Initiative comes in, because obviously they're not going to come in and help Serbia once they're part of the EU, because the EU does not align with China at all. On our side, we get a benefit from China without surrendering sovereignty. They're much more likely to cooperate. And also, even if they win this entirety of the economy, I think that we weigh that against the fact that they literally lose Kosovo. And they branched it, like they phrased it like, oh yeah, it's just normal relationships with Kosovo. They're all going to be good friends. No, this is a huge like conceding under their side, right? Currently, Serbia thinks Kosovo is part of their land, right? Once they actually join the EU, they like act it as if it's an independent state and they recognize its legitimacy. This is huge. This means that there is a distinct harm under their side, where ethnic Serbians within Kosovo are either not governed by their own people, or like even worse, allowed to be governed on a majority that is like owned by like Albanians or like by Croatians who like literally do not like them. This is possibly one of the biggest harms under their side, where they surrender Kosovo, where they surrender independence, either to a liberal, neoliberal institution that does not align with any of their beliefs, or even worse, one of their enemies. So we think this is a huge harm under their side. I'll quickly do security. Obviously, I think like I just want like I don't know if they. Yeah, so a bit of preemptive and like rebuttal. We think that from Ukraine, obviously the West is probably not the best like form of support for Serbia, because as we've already seen, like the West is extremely reluctant to actually give Ukraine any F-16s, any tanks, any form of like actual physical troops within a station within the ground. We think that Russia is a way bigger incentive to actually like give security to Serbia, because it's one of the only like nations around them that is not part of the EU. We think that this incentive, we weigh it against like the benefit, like the like so-called benefit on their side, where they'd be like, oh yeah, they're going to get troops from the West. We think Serbia is such a marginal, small country for the EU, but it's a huge country for Russia because of its geographical significance, because they're one of the only non-EU member states in their area. We think on our side, Russia is a much better incentive to protect Serbia. Thank you. Economically and politically.
Fantastic. We thank that speaker very much for their speech, and we welcome the second speaker of the negative team.
Rare occurrence of masks coming off. weigh-up of contributions, you should be weighing the negative team's case much higher in the debate, because we have a much simpler way in winning this debate. Our case is that there is a set of benefits that you get from not withdrawing that are independent of entering the EU. And if you then enter the EU, you get a massive set of benefits which outweigh anything they got. Because we got easier trade with the EU, because you already had pre-accession agreements that made trade deals easier, which reduced the amount of tariffs, which become higher when you withdraw. Secondly, you already are participating in some economic forums at the moment, which increase your economic capacity. Thirdly, the EU doesn't hate you and doesn't see you as a Russian ally, so they're unlikely to sanction you. Fourthly, you don't lose EU money, but they put aside to you. 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, a question on Kosovo. Secondly, a question on economics and relations. Thirdly, a question on sovereignty. Firstly, the question on Kosovo. This is where the affirmative team tries to win the debate the fastest, because their claim is you care a lot about Kosovo. Let's do 2 things to this. Firstly, it's unclear why the EU requests that you leave Kosovo. They never mechanize this out for you. Instead, I'm going to explain to you that they actually do not ask for you to recognize Kosovo as a separate independent state. Firstly, just empirically know, in the past year they have dropped this requirement, and the mechanistic reasons for this are twofold. Firstly, the EU just generally care about peace and stability in a region, so they want something that's similar to the China and Taiwan situation, where China can claim Taiwan, but they don't invade and genocide Taiwan. They want similar situations here with Kosovo, where where you claim Kosovo, but you don't go genociding them. You allow them to act independently, but you don't, and so we thought they were willing to support that. So they never conceded this, but you still gain the benefit of the outside being able to claim that you entered a fragile situation that just worked out for everyone. Secondly, the EU also wanted truth and reconciliation councils to help reduce the amount of tensions between nations. But we argue this has already occurred by NATO and by the EU, and so you've already fulfilled this metric. So the EU, and the reason why as well is because it's just a small harm. So if you don't believe that, it's a much smaller harm to eat truth and reconciliation councils than having to give up Kosovo's independence, and you're probably willing to take that because it's like you don't have to talk much about it. So that all explains then why the EU never requests this, massively undercutting their case. However, even if the EU requests this, you're never going to win the issue of Kosovo for 3-fold reasons. Firstly, Kosovo has a distinct identity as they concede at first affirmative as being strongly Albanian. Secondly, they claim that it's fiercely independent, so it's unclear why you're able to ever capture them into the future under their side. But thirdly, they're already independent and they've already conducted a bunch of independent deals, like engaging with the World Bank and engaging with the IMF. So they're already moving to their ways of accessing sovereignty, and it's probably only a matter of time before they leave you because they have enough support. So we think that the Kosovo was one that you're willing to trade off. We thought that, so either case, you don't give up Kosovo, or you're willing to give up Kosovo and outweigh this for the massive benefits we're providing to you on stability and common currency. That brings me then on to the second issue, where we talk about economics and relations. Because they try to push hard on us that you're very close to Russia and you don't get a lot from entering the EU. Let's look at Russia. They claim is you get fertilizers and oil from Russia. I guess 5-fold reasons to this. Firstly, it's unclear why Russia sanctions you now, given that they didn't sanction you during the pre-accession agreement, where you're already shown to move away from them. And the reason why, the reason why they don't want to further sanction you is probably because if you buy that you're reliant on Russia, they don't want to lose one of their few trading partners left. And so as a result, that means then that you're unlikely to be sanctioned. Secondly, even if you are going to be sanctioned, we still think we win out. Because firstly, it's unclear, the war sanctions currently on Russia have killed a lot of Russian exports. So it's unclear what Russia is actually providing to you. Their oil and fertilizer exports are massively reduced. That point of mitigation is important because the second thing it explains is that the EU can now assist you with things like fertilizer and oil. Fertilizer being a fairly simple thing that relies on fairly simple like chemicals and like very basic chemicals like ammonia. Nations like Germany who have good chemical production are able to produce things like fertilizer for you, so you're able to fill this in and you're able, but secondly, oil and natural reserves. These are things that we think they have, the EU has reserves on, given that, and you think they can get other trading partner and access to things like potential, I don't know, the Middle East. Thirdly, the third thing to say to this is that the EU has currently set $2.8 million euros of development aid for you when you do enter the EU. And so that meant that when you, and the idea was developing the nation, and that when you get access to this, that meant you were no longer reliant on other nations. You could develop your economy because you aren't just reliant on grain. The reason why the EU has set this money behind is because they see you as an investment, and if they can grow you up and you are producing more, then you can produce more to the union, you give more labor, you are able to give, say, more productive grain, which they need in these cases. The fourth and final thing is like, if they're close to Russia and then they withdraw under their side, the EU now has just incentives to sanction you if you stay close to Russia because you're a Russian ally and you're breaking the collective action problem that the EU wants to do in solving Russia. So that means that you get active harm from withdrawing. The second claim that they're trying to make at second affirmative is that Russia provides you for provides security services. One, unclear why you need troops. I don't see you being invaded, so this and they don't recognize it up. But secondly, Russia is crumbling. Their military is just empirically falling. Unclear where they get you. Then they try to say, what are the benefits of a common currency? We thought there are threefold benefits of a common currency. Firstly, you're able to import goods a lot easier because the current currency had a lot higher value than your current value. So it meant that you were able to get increased the quality of life of your citizens when you access the euro, which is pretty good. Secondly, stability from this common currency is that if you are failed, you have the entire EU to back you up and support you out. Looks like what the EU did to support Greece when they were failing as well. They have incentive because if you fail, then everyone else hurts. The third thing to say is that exist things like central bank lending. Because the EU central bank is so much larger, they are much able to support you and there's much greater stability. That's the importance of central currency. The final thing that they like to claim is that trade deals with EU are likely to be symmetric. However, there are twofold problems with this that do not engage with the analysis that we get you at Mayo. They say, firstly, because these trade deals exist due to the pre-accession agreements. So you lose the reason why they give this is they see you as an investment in the future to develop you. That's why these agreements exist. However, when you because you can increase the productivity. But when you withdraw, you're no longer investment. That's just a sink of money from them because they explain that because that Serbia doesn't have a lot to provide to the EU and thus it's not something that they give. But secondly, under their side, tariffs are likely to increase when you withdraw. That makes exporting harder. That means like also visa and worker movement is much harder. So it means that a lot of your workers who are currently working in say EU nation states are stuck or they lose jobs or have a lot of harm. The final claim that they like to say, because the Serbia is that's actually on sovereignty. Which actually, so economics, we thought also a lot of main benefits. You should weigh this very highly because that allowed for the development, that allowed for the massive improvement of the nation. We thought that was pretty good to achieve. Then finally on sovereignty, they have two pushes. They firstly say that you're attached to the Eurocrats, but they misunderstand the purpose of the EU. The EU exists as a trading bloc to best support nations. It exists to solve collective action problems, say around labor rights, around kind of like with trade. So it looks like, for example, antibiotics. What they've done is that antibiotics is the system looks like solving trade disputes through EU court, looks like labor rights. But the idea of fixing labor rights, and the idea of fixing labor rights is important because Serbia as a developing nation currently doesn't have good labor rights, but it's much harder for them to upgrade their labor rights for the fear of being undercut by other nations who can export their labor at much cheaper rates. When you're with the EU, they have the incentive to protect your labor rights in order and to help you develop. But the second thing to say is that the EU doesn't want to piss off its member states. They don't want the risk of you leaving. They don't want you to, and it's unclear why they're likely to take these actions. Given that they allow, for example, Italy protectionism and they allow for other conservative states to exist in the EU. The final claim to say is that Serbia is economically small and so you don't have a lot of power in the EU. But truthfully, a couple of things on this. Firstly, our case isn't contingent on economic power in the EU. But secondly, we flip this on them because Mayor explains that if you're economically small, then China exploits you. Under our side, you can play both sides of the game. You can play to China, you can play to Russia, you can play to EU, and you have that power because you're engaging with multiple of them. And so we thought this didn't matter. We were very proud to engage.
Thank you so much to that speaker for their speech, and to conclude the case.
The EU identified Serbia as a potential candidate for the EU and that one would be beneficial for membership all the way back in 2003. So it's procrastinated this deal for a very long time.
And that procrastination has been quite good for Serbia, because as the EU gets increasingly restless to try and get this country in, and it's pragmatic about its investments that it's already made, it's engaged in a cycle of sunk cost fallacy where it feels like it needs a return on its investments, the kinds of negotiations and compromises that have been made have been ones that have sided for Serbia over the last few years. They've increased their infrastructure packages. They have done things like decrease the kinds of demands that they have. Previously, they said you have to entirely recognize Kosovo as an independent state. Now they're literally just like, you have to you have to normalize relations. Formalizing would be really bad for us. Normalize relations, and that would be the end of it. And that's the kind of thing that we are getting on their side. On their side, they withdraw from that deal entirely, and thus they withdraw from all the great benefits that the EU provides. Two issues in this speech, firstly on Kosovo, and secondly on economic benefits. Firstly on Kosovo, they explained that the population of Serbia would be particularly offended if you had to acknowledge the existence of Kosovo. We explained the burden is not to recognize independence because the new plan is merely to normalize relations, and the revealed preference of the EU is that recognition is only a means to the end of stability. So if you can get stability, you do not need that recognition. Liv is very nuanced in her response to this when she explains normalizing relations is a bigger deal than we think. Like, yes, it's probably not just like you literally sign a document. You probably have to do things like, like have less border control measures. You probably have to do things like establish tribunals and all that kind of stuff to make amends on things like war crimes. But Auguste explains that a lot of that process has already completed because the EU and NATO have already in the 90s have been involved in things like war tribunals and truth and reconciliation commissions. And a lot of the population, as a result, has moved on to some degree from those war crimes because of that process. But also, we explain a number of reasons why this consideration is not the most important in this debate. Firstly, it's the animosity towards this kind of deal was an animosity that was born from the fact that you would inevitably have to recognize Kosovo as independent. And that's the thing that made the original EU deal unpopular and has stalled it out for this long. But comparatively, the deal that Serbia is offering to its population now is that, well, we don't need to recognize them, we only need to normalize relations, which means that comparatively on that timeline, it is seen as a success to that population. That population is likely to internalize it as less of an us. Secondly, we explained that the growing population is disinterested in this because in 2003, there were loads of people that maybe cared about this, but now in 2022, there's a lot of Zoomers that not necessarily don't care about this, like they learn about it in textbooks, but they didn't have those lived experiences and therefore have deprioritized that in that mind. But also, importantly, the reason why, and if you read the mechanisms within their case, the reason why people have ethnic tension and are angry at Kosovo isn't a territorial dispute, but it's a dispute about the fact that they have committed war crimes and they have had ethnic conflict, which is to say that the territory of Kosovo isn't things that pisses people off. It is the fact that they committed war crimes. Those are things that we've ameliorated. Necessarily normalizing relations in a territorial sense is not the thing that is causing friction. But lastly, we explained that for a long time, you've already joined the pre-accession phase, which means this isn't like a shock to people. People have already, like all the boomers on your side, have already been dreading and fearing this kind of thing, and had time to contemplate it for like more than a decade, right? Which means that the kind of backlash you're able to get on their side is unlikely to be large because it's not a shock. It's something that, it's an unfortunate trade-off, but it's a trade-off that they're willing to buy. And they were willing to buy it because as these pre-extension deals came in, because as the 2013 stability program came in, these people were able to get jobs. These people were able to join the global economy. And they saw that trade-off as one that was necessary despite being unfortunately necessary. Lastly, they never comparatively explain why you are able to retake Kosovo under their system, which means that to a large degree, the failure that is perceived by the population, if there is a population of people who feel aggrieved by the fact that Kosovo is independent, is one that is already sunk under your side. Importantly, Kosovo has been operating as an independent government and administration in the same way Taiwan has in the last 30 years. You are literally not really losing out on anything. So, Kosovo is important for a lot of people, but that set of people is increasingly small and increasingly less concerned with this in terms of the trade-off to economic benefits. So if we can prove that you get significant economic benefits, we win this debate. Why is economic benefits the most important issue? It is the most concrete harm. To clarify, Gus said 2 million, it's actually 2 billion. That's a typo, not new substantive. But the EU has already invested $2 billion in infrastructure and budgeted that, and they've engaged in preferential trade deals. And you lose all of that, and that is a definite outcome because you're already in the process of getting those things. So we know definitely you're going to lose those things if you withdraw. And the reason why that you'll lose those things if you withdraw is because the reason why the EU's thrown money at Serbia is because they see it as an investment in which you can get a return in the future. At the point at which you leave the EU and they know you no longer have an intention to be part of the EU in the future, that investment makes no sense. So they're likely to just pull money away from that budget and invest it in other kinds of places. Liv says that there's a timeline issue because, like, obviously our sneaky frame is like, you can get all of the benefits without actually joining the EU, which, to be clear, is a massive benefit. But Liv is like, well, you can't inevitably delay this kind of thing. We've already procrastinated since 2003, so Serbia can probably procrastinate a few more years, and each of those years getting millions of dollars in infrastructure, which is great. But at the point at which you get that, the delay is due to negotiations and compromises, which are increasingly favorable to Serbia. So the point at which you join the EU, it will be a really, really, really great deal. They say, well, you can get EU stuff anyway. Their mechanisms are twofold, given at third speaker. Firstly, the fact that Serbia has a skilled population that the EU needs. Importantly, yes, that may be true, but you get a lot of frictional inability to employ these people at the point at which each of these people have to apply for a visa as opposed to literally just crossing the border and packing their bags, which massively decreases their mobility and ability to go there. The second mechanism is the idea that Serbia has things that you can trade. Yes, you might have cheap grain. The problem is, one, you don't have those preferential trade deals, which means you aren't the first partner they go for. Secondly, there are tariffs on that grain, which means that even though your grain is cheaper than an EU country's grain, because of the tariff added on top, your grain is no longer cheaper, which means that necessarily your grain is less valuable. And lastly, even if that grain is cheap, you're paying them in Serbian currency, which is currency they don't want because they see it as weak, compared to if you join the EU and engage in the EU currency. And importantly, our benefits aren't just restricted to trade. Like, maybe they co-op trade, but we explain. Firstly, you get loads of investment and aid and infrastructure building. Secondly, you get regulation, things like labor laws. Serbia can't upgrade its labor laws right now, and the reason for that is because there's a collective action problem within Balkan states, where if you upgrade your labor laws, other countries will undercut you. If you join the EU, you solve that collective action problem because every country there has minimum labor laws. You get things like regulation. You get things like trade dispute regulation from courts, which means that international investors are far more trusting in you because you have an arbitrator that is confident in you. You get things like bailout if you hit economic crisis. In the worst case scenario, where you lose all this trade from Russia, you're going to get that bailout from the EU because the EU cares about your economy, which means that those benefits are ones they could never co-opt because they only came from membership within the EU or some kind of pre-accession deal rather than just like having some trade benefits. We explained Russia is not crucial to Serbia because Russia already would have had incentives to pull out. I think Gus has dealt with this well. Lastly, in terms of Belt and Road and bargaining power, like, China is not dichotomously opposed to the EU. You obviously have more bargaining power if you're able to demonstrate you have more capital and more ability to negotiate with China. That was a big win on our side. For these reasons, very proud to
Thank you so much, everyone, for that debate. Obviously, don't go far. Results are being announced as soon as they're available, so that will be relatively imminently. But congratulations to both teams on a fantastic debate. Yeah, of course.
Oh, yeah. Where did we go?
David and Liv, what did you veto?
And what did they?
They vetoed the middle one then. Well, the non-Serbian one.
Okay, so true.
That sounds like something